Sienna Stone didn't expect her ex to show up at her father's birthday barbecue, especially not with a smug grin, a bottle of wine, and a bouquet of flowers like it wasn't 2 years too late. She froze on the back porch, her sundress swaying in the soft breeze as she clutched the tray of grilled corn. Her dad, Paul Stone, was flipping burgers by the grill, humming some old country song while her 6-year-old daughter, Piper, chased Bubbles in the yard. "Hey, Sienna," came that voice she hadn't heard since the night she kicked him out of her penthouse. "Long time." Her grip tightened on the tray. "Derek, what are you doing here?" He held up the wine like that answered anything. "Heard it was Paul's birthday, thought I'd stop by." "He didn't invite you," she said sharply. Paul turned, spatula in hand, brows furrowed. "Everything okay, honey?" Before she could speak, Derek stepped forward with that practiced fake charm. "Paul, you're looking great, man. Brought your favorite." He handed him the wine. Paul didn't take it. He looked at Sienna, then back at Derek. "You weren't invited." Derek laughed like it was all a joke. "Come on, it's a backyard barbecue. I'm just being neighborly." "We're not neighbors," Paul said, stepping between Derek and his daughter. "You're the guy who broke her heart, left her raising a baby alone, and now you show up here like it's 2015. Sienna's chest tightened. She hadn't told her dad all the details, but clearly he knew enough. Derek's eyes narrowed. "You don't have to be dramatic." "Get out," Paul said, voice firm. "Before I forget I'm wearing an apron." Derek scoffed, but Paul wasn't joking. He set down the spatula and straightened, all 5'11" of aging ex-construction worker muscle. Derek hesitated, then turned his eyes back to Sienna. "You're throwing this away over what? Some fantasy? You think you're too good for me now because you're rich." "I didn't get rich by accident," she fired back. "I built my company from scratch while you were out wasting your own potential." "Right," he said, his voice bitter now. "Still playing CEO, still pretending you're better than everyone." Before Sienna could reply, a deep voice cut through the tension like a blade. "She doesn't have to pretend. She is better than you." She turned, stunned, as a tall man in a navy button-down stepped through the back gate. His hair was dark, his jaw sharp, and his presence somehow louder than the music playing through the patio speakers. Piper stopped mid-bubble chase and ran over to him. "Cam." He crouched just in time to catch her in his arms. Sienna blinked. "What are you doing here?" Camden Davis, her daughter's favorite person in the world, the man who'd been helping her dad with house repairs all summer, the guy who wore beat-up boots and drove a rusty pickup, looked at her with a strange softness in his eyes. "Paul invited me." Her dad nodded like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Told him I needed help hanging those new lights. Figured he'd stay for a burger." Derek's lip curled. "And who's this supposed to be?" "Camden Davis," he said, standing to his full height, Piper still wrapped around his leg. "And if you don't leave, I'll show you what happens when someone disrespects a woman in front of her kid." Derek scoffed again, but he didn't push it. Not with Camden standing there like he had nothing to lose. With one last glare at Sienna, he turned and walked out the gate. Silence fell over the backyard until Piper broke it. "Can I have a burger now?" Everyone laughed, even Paul. Later, after the grill was off and Piper was inside watching cartoons, Sienna found Camden near the fence, fixing a loose board. She folded her arms. "You didn't have to do that." He glanced at her, his eyes darker than usual. "Yes, I did." She tilted her head. "Why?" He straightened, brushing dirt off his hands. "Because I don't like seeing you hurt or treated like you're less than you are." She stared at him. "I thought you were just the guy helping out around my dad's place." "I am," he shrugged. "But I'm also a guy who's been watching you run yourself into the ground, trying to prove you're strong enough to do it all alone." Her throat tightened. I'm not weak. No, he said, stepping closer. You're the strongest woman I've ever met, but even strong people need someone in their corner. She looked up at him, his voice low and steady, his eyes filled with something that made her heart skip. I didn't know you cared, she said. He smiled soft. I didn't know I did either, until today. She stood there, silent, heart thudding in her chest, while the porch lights flickered on behind them. He didn't kiss her. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, something shifted. Something real. And Sienna, who'd spent years building walls, felt the first one crack. Camden's truck rumbled to life as the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long amber shadows over the lawn. Sienna watched from the porch, her arms wrapped around herself though the summer air still clung warm to her skin. Piper had fallen asleep on the couch, her head resting in her mother's lap, the TV humming low with some animal documentary she didn't finish. Sienna had meant to thank Camden before he left, really thank him, but something about the way he'd looked at her earlier had made her forget how to speak. And now he was pulling out of the driveway, tires crunching softly over gravel, his window cracked just enough to let in the night air. Is he your boyfriend now? Came her dad's voice from behind her. She looked over her shoulder. Paul leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a faint glint of amusement in his eyes. No, she said, turning back to the driveway. He's just Camden. He didn't look like just anything when he stepped in earlier. She didn't respond. Instead, she rubbed Piper's back gently and kept her eyes on the road until the truck disappeared around the bend. Paul stepped onto the porch and sat beside her. You know, I used to think you were trying to prove something by never settling down. I wasn't trying to prove anything. He gave her a look. You were, and I get it. After what happened with Piper's dad, there wasn't much room to trust anyone, but not everyone's like that. She lowered her eyes. It's not about trust. Then what is it? She hesitated, then answered honestly. It's about control. When you've built everything yourself, it's hard to hand over even a piece of it to someone else. Paul didn't argue. He just nodded slowly. Well, if you ever do want to take a step back, you might want someone beside you who doesn't care about your money or your titles. She let that sink in. Camden hadn't asked her a single question about her business. Not once. He'd spent the summer fixing broken fence posts, installing ceiling fans, and playing tag with Piper in the yard like it was the most natural thing in the world. And not once had he looked at her like she was anything other than a woman trying to keep her family together. Later that night, after she'd carried Piper to bed and tucked her in, Sienna walked into the kitchen to make tea and noticed something by the back door. A brown paper bag with her name scrawled on it in bold handwriting. Inside was a small box of chai tea, her favorite, and a folded note. Found this at the market, figured you'd need it after today. Cam. She stared at the note for a long time, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper. He hadn't signed it with anything more than his name. No flourish, no expectation, just a simple gesture. The next morning, Sienna took Piper to her office downtown. Her assistant, Kelsey, greeted them at the elevator with a coffee in one hand and a report in the other. Morning, boss. Piper, you look adorable. Piper beamed and twirled in her overalls. I brought my coloring books. Sienna smiled. We'll set her up in the break room. She knows the drill. Once Piper was settled with snacks and crayons, Sienna ducked into her corner office. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the skyline, and the soft hum of traffic below filled the air with a low rhythm she found calming. She sank into her chair and opened the report Kelsey had handed her. But her mind kept drifting. At lunch, she sat across from her CFO in a sleek rooftop restaurant that overlooked the harbor, but she barely touched her grilled salmon. You okay? He asked. She nodded, just tired. Want me to take the lead on the expansion pitch this week? She looked at him. No, I've got it. Then she hesitated. Actually, could you come in a little early tomorrow? I want to run through the numbers again. Sure, want me to bring coffee? She paused. No, I'm switching to tea. That night, after putting Piper to bed again and answering the last of her emails, she found herself scrolling through her contacts. Her thumb hovered over Camden's name. She hadn't saved it under anything fancy. Just Cam. She tapped it. The next evening, he showed up at her door just after sunset, wiping his hands on a rag. You called, he said simply. She nodded, wanted to return the tea. He looked at the bag in her hand. That's not how gifts work. Then I owe you dinner. His eyebrows lifted, but he didn't tease. You cook. I order very well. His mouth tugged into something close to a smile. Best kind of chef. They ate on the back porch, the cicadas singing in the trees and the porch light casting gentle halos over their plates. Piper had already eaten and was inside, watching a movie. Sienna poured them both glasses of wine, nothing fancy, just enough to soften the edges of a long day. You're quiet tonight, Camden said after a while. I'm thinking. Dangerous. She glanced at him. You ever think about what you'd do if you didn't have to work for money? He leaned back in his chair, already kinda live that way. What do you mean? I don't make much, but I don't need much. I fix things, I help people, I like it. She studied him, so you'd never want more. He looked out at the trees. Sure, I want a life, a real one, but it's not about money, it's about who I build that life with. She didn't speak, just watched him, and suddenly, the idea of letting someone in didn't feel like giving something up. It felt like sharing something that had only been hers for too long. Camden turned to her. Why'd you really ask me here tonight? I wanted to see what it felt like. To do what? To sit beside someone and not feel like I have to prove anything. He didn't move, didn't push. He just sat there with her, the night wrapped around them like a secret neither of them wanted to break. And when she stood to go inside, he followed her to the door, paused, then said, Next time, let me cook. She smiled. Deal. The scent of fresh lumber clung to Camden's skin when he arrived at the stone house late Saturday afternoon, a toolbox in one hand and a grocery bag in the other. Sienna opened the door before he could knock. Her hair was pulled into a loose braid, and she wore an oversized linen shirt half tucked into jeans. For a second, she looked at him like she wasn't sure what to say. You're early, she said finally. You said 6, it's 5:30. I meant emotionally early. Camden stepped inside without hesitation. I'll try to contain myself. She closed the door behind him, watching as he headed straight for the kitchen like he belonged there. The grocery bag landed on the counter with a soft thud. You're actually cooking, she asked, leaning against the frame. He pulled out a bundle of rosemary and a wedge of Parmesan. Unless you want another night of takeout and wine. I didn't say I objected. He glanced at her, then turned back to the food. I figured you deserved more than something that comes in a box. Sienna didn't reply. The way he said it made her stomach twist in a way she didn't know how to interpret. Camden moved around the kitchen with quiet confidence, rinsing vegetables, slicing garlic, setting water to boil. It was unnerving how easily he fit into her space. Piper's upstairs, by the way. She's building a zoo out of cardboard boxes. Camden nodded. She asked me to bring more tape. I brought 3 rolls. That explains the extra grocery bag. Said she needed structural support, her words. Sienna laughed, then caught herself. She wasn't used to laughing like that anymore, not the kind that surprised her into silence afterward. By the time the pasta was plated and the borrowed candles from her dad's garage flickered on the table, Piper had wandered down in her socks, dragging a stuffed giraffe. "We're having a dinner party," she asked. "Cam made pasta," Sienna said. "Want some?" Piper eyed the plate suspiciously. "Does it have green things?" "Only the tiniest ones," Camden replied. "They're flavor ninjas." She considered. "Okay, but only if I get the giraffe seat." Sienna raised an eyebrow. "What's the giraffe seat?" "The seat with the best view of the backyard," Piper said, already climbing into the chair by the window. Camden served her first. By the time the plates were empty and Piper was nodding off beside a stack of napkins, Sienna stood and gently lifted her into her arms. "I'll be back," she said over her shoulder. Camden collected the dishes in silence, rinsing them in the sink while the hum of the dishwasher filled the quiet. When Sienna returned, her sleeves were rolled up and her eyes softer. She was asleep before her head hit the pillow. He dried his hands on a dish towel. "She's a good kid." "She is." Sienna leaned against the counter, studying him like she was trying to figure out something she hadn't dared ask yet. Camden wasn't the kind of man who filled silences for the sake of it. He waited. "You've never asked me about my company," she said. He looked over. "Is that a problem?" "No, it's just unusual." "You want me to ask?" She considered. "Maybe. I think part of me wants to know what you think when you find out." Camden crossed his arms slowly. "I already know what kind of person you are. What you do doesn't change that. But it might change what you imagine your life could look like." He met her gaze, steady. "I don't imagine my life in numbers. Imagine it in moments." "And what kind of moments are those?" "The kind where someone trusts me enough to tell me the things they think no one wants to hear." Sienna's breath caught. "I started it after Piper was born," she said. "I had no savings, a newborn, and a half-finished degree. It was supposed to be a side hustle, a few freelance design jobs to keep the lights on. But one client led to another. Then I hired one person, then 5, then 30. Camden didn't interrupt. "I didn't sleep more than 4 hours a night for 3 years. I missed birthdays. I forgot to eat. I stayed up learning code when I didn't have money to hire someone who already knew it. And when I finally signed my first 7-figure contract, I cried in the bathroom for 20 minutes because I didn't know who I was anymore." He pushed away from the counter and walked toward her. "Did you think I'd be intimidated?" "People have been," she said quietly, "even the ones who say they won't be." Camden stopped inches from her, his voice low. "I don't care how many zeros are in your bank account. Care that you built something without anyone handing it to you. And I care that you still tuck your daughter in every night like she's the only thing that matters." She didn't move, didn't speak. Then, after a moment, she reached up and touched his face like she wasn't sure he was real. "Why are you like this?" she whispered. "Like what?" "Like you see through everything." He smiled, not the kind people use as social currency, but the kind that reached his eyes and stayed there. "Because I've never had anyone look at me the way you do when you think I'm not paying attention." Her fingers curled into his shirt. "And what happens if I let you in?" "Then you won't be doing this alone anymore." Sienna leaned in before she could stop herself and kissed him. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't careful. It was the kind of kiss that unraveled things she hadn't realized were still knotted inside her. His hands slid to her waist, grounding her in a way that made everything else disappear: the board meetings, the deadlines, the pressure pressing against her ribs like stones. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. "I don't know what this is yet," she said. "You don't have to. But I want to find out." "Good," Camden said, "because I'm not going anywhere." She believed him. And for the first time in years, that didn't scare her. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, gold embossed, heavy stock, and slipped beneath Sienna's office door by Kelsey, who offered no explanation beyond a single raised brow. Sienna unfolded it slowly. "The Greater Summit Gala," she read aloud, her voice flat. "Black tie, waterfront pavilion." Kelsey leaned against the doorway. "Your name's on the donor list this year. They're honoring founders who have made significant community investments." Sienna stared at the card. She hadn't expected recognition. She'd written the check for the community center quietly, under the radar, the way she preferred everything outside her company to be. No press. No speeches, just impact. "I don't usually go to these," she said finally. Kelsey gave a half shrug. "You're not usual anymore." That night, she sat on her bed with Piper curled beside her, both of them in pajamas, the window cracked open to let in the sound of summer rain. Piper was drawing a picture of their backyard zoo, tongue between her lips, completely focused. "Do you think giraffes would like galas?" Piper asked, not looking up. "They'd knock over all the decorations," Sienna replied. Piper giggled. "You should still go." Sienna rolled onto her side. "I don't know, it's not really my kind of thing." "Cam would go." Sienna blinked. "What makes you say that?" "Because he likes when you do things that make you proud." She didn't answer. Instead, she took the crayon from Piper's hand and added a tiny bow tie to the giraffe. Camden didn't hesitate when she asked him. The question had barely left her lips before he said, "Tell me what time to pick you up." She hadn't told him it was black tie. She hadn't needed to. On the night of the gala, she stepped into her father's living room in a deep sapphire gown she hadn't worn in years. It hugged her frame without apology, and she'd pulled her hair into a sleek twist, not for anyone else, but because she felt like being remembered that night. Paul stood from the couch, his eyes wide. "Is it too much?" she asked, smoothing her hands over the fabric. "You look like the kind of woman people don't just notice, they remember." Before she could respond, Camden's truck pulled into the driveway. When he knocked, Piper beat her to the door, flinging it open with zero ceremony. "Whoa," was all she said. Camden stood in the doorway in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his hair combed back neatly, the usual calluses on his hands somehow making him look more grounded, not less polished. Sienna's breath caught, but she recovered quickly. "You clean up alarmingly well." He gave a slow once-over. "You're going to make this entire room forget how to breathe." Piper grinned. "You look like a movie." They dropped her off with Paul, who had set up a movie night complete with popcorn and a fort made from couch cushions. Camden gave Piper a high five and promised to text her a giraffe fact before bedtime. The gala was held in a glass atrium by the water, chandeliers glittering overhead like suspended constellations. String music floated through the air, and waiters moved like shadows between tables with trays of champagne. Sienna paused before they stepped inside. "You sure you want to do this?" Camden adjusted his cufflinks. "I've driven in a blizzard with a broken axle. I think I can handle a few rich people in tuxedos." Inside, the shift was immediate. Heads turned. Whispers followed. A few executives she recognized from past deals nodded politely, but most looked between her and Camden with thinly veiled curiosity. She leaned in slightly. "They're trying to figure out who you are." He smiled without looking away from the room. "Good, let him wonder." The program began, speeches echoing through the glass as the city lights flickered in the bay below. When Sienna's name was called, she hesitated only a second before rising. Her heels clicked softly against the marble as she crossed the stage to accept the plaque. She didn't speak long, just enough to thank the people who had helped her build the company and the community that gave her a place to grow. When she returned to her seat, Camden stood quietly, waiting until she sat before he whispered, "I'm proud of you." She turned to him, "You barely know what to do." "I don't need to. See how people look at you when you walk into a room, like they're waiting for permission to be better." Later, on the balcony overlooking the water, she leaned against the railing, the wind pushing strands of hair loose from her twist. Camden stepped behind her, his hand resting lightly at her waist. "You know, I always thought I'd end up with someone quiet, someone who didn't challenge me. And now, I think I was just afraid of someone who would." Sienna turned to face him. "I built everything in my life from the ground up. Didn't leave space for anyone who wasn't going to stay." "I didn't come here for the view," he said. "I came because you asked." "And what if I ask you to stay longer than one night?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, folded slip of paper. She opened it. It was a drawing. Piper's giraffe now wearing a bow tie and standing under a paper banner that read "Our Zoo." Sienna laughed, then pressed the paper to her chest. "She gave you this." She said, "Should bring it in case you needed reminding." She looked at him, something raw and honest in her eyes. "I don't need reminding. I just needed someone who saw the things I stopped showing." He brushed a hand along her cheek. "Then show me." Sienna kissed him again, not the startled, uncertain kiss from before, but something deeper. Decided. It felt like a promise. 3 weeks later, her father walked her down the stone path in the backyard, Piper tossing flower petals ahead of them in gleeful handfuls. Neighbors lined the chairs, and the community center director stood at the front, holding a small book and trying not to cry. Camden waited in a crisp white shirt and a navy vest, his hands steady, his eyes locked on hers like nothing else existed. It wasn't extravagant, it wasn't planned months in advance, but it was real. And when Camden leaned down to kiss her, with her daughter cheering behind them and her father beaming with pride, Sienna finally understood what it meant to build something not for survival, but for joy. She had built an empire. But this was the kingdom she'd keep. Camden tilted his head beneath the warm spray of the outdoor shower just off the side of the bungalow, the ocean breeze brushing against his skin as he reached for the towel Sienna handed him through the louvered door. "You realize you've officially ruined me for any kind of normal honeymoon," he called out. She leaned against the doorframe, barefoot in a crisp white linen wrap, her damp hair curling at the ends from the salt water. "You say that like I didn't watch you negotiate with the concierge until they upgraded us to the villa with the private beach." "I didn't negotiate," he said as he stepped inside, toweling his hair. "I just mentioned it was our wedding week and that you'd built a company that helped fund their new tech system, and they practically handed me the keys." Sienna raised an eyebrow. "So you played the guilt card?" "I played the gratitude card." She laughed, then slipped her arm around his waist as they walked toward the open-air kitchen. A platter of grilled pineapple, avocado toast, and fresh mango waited on the counter, delivered by the resort's chef just after sunrise. "Piper called," she said as she poured them both glasses of iced hibiscus tea. "Well, my dad called, and she stole the phone." Camden sat on the edge of the outdoor couch, pulling her down onto his lap. "How's the cardboard zoo holding up without its architect?" She added a dolphin exhibit, using the bathtub. He laughed, low and warm. "She's going to run the world one day." "She's already running ours." Sienna rested her head against his shoulder as the waves crashed in the distance. For the first time in years, there was no to-do list, no client waiting on a proposal, no silent pressure to be everything at once. Just the weight of his hand resting over hers and the steady rhythm of the ocean. "You know what I've been thinking about?" she asked. "Tell me." "The way you never asked for more than I could give." Camden looked at her, his thumb brushing lightly along her knuckles. "I never needed more than you already were." She turned to face him, her gaze steady. "I want to bring you into the business. That's not a metaphor. I mean it. I've watched you lead without demanding control, and I need that kind of presence on my board." He blinked. "You're serious?" "I've never been more serious. You've got an eye for people, for structure, for balance. You grounded my father's entire property renovation with a pencil sketch and a 3-hour Home Depot trip. I build things with my hands, Sienna. And I build them with ideas. We're stronger together." He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then I'm in, but only if you let me reorganize your operations floor. The spatial layout is a disaster." She gasped. "You've been holding that in, haven't you?" 3 months. They spent the rest of the morning, wrapped in sun-warmed cotton, and shared glances that said more than words ever could. No grand declarations, no over-the-top spectacle, just the quiet certainty of having chosen each other fully. Back home 2 weeks later, Camden moved into the guest house first not because of hesitation, but because it was closer to where Piper's zoo had now expanded into a full-blown, wildlife sanctuary. He worked with Paul on small construction projects during the day and sat in on strategic planning sessions at Sienna's office in the evenings, gradually becoming the kind of leader who didn't just make space, but shaped it. Sienna, for her part, let go of the reins just enough to breathe. She started leaving her phone in another room at night. She asked for help when she needed it. Most of all, she let herself be loved without apology. One evening, while Piper was asleep and Paul was at his weekly poker night, Camden found her on the back porch, curled under a blanket with her laptop open and a dozen sticky notes stuck to her knee. "Tell me you're not working," he said, setting 2 mugs of hot apple cider on the table. "I'm not," she replied. "I'm dreaming." He joined her under the blanket, about a retreat property, out near the lake, a place for single parents who need time to reset. Nobody ever gives them rest. I want to change that. Camden kissed her temple. "Then let's build it." She closed the laptop and looked at him. "You're really in this with me, aren't you?" "All the way." The official papers were signed 6 months later. Stone and Davis initiatives, launched with funding from both Sienna's company and a silent investor, Camden had tracked down a former client whose daughter had once stayed at the community center Sienna had helped fund. They broke ground on the first retreat property that autumn, with Piper cutting the ribbon using a pair of oversized gold scissors and declaring herself Vice President of Fun. That winter, they celebrated their first Christmas as a family in a log cabin Camden had built years ago and never found the right reason to return to. Sienna decorated it with silver and deep blue ornaments, and Piper insisted on leaving out 3 cookies, one for Santa, one for the reindeer, and one for Cam because, in her words, he built the chimney. On New Year's Eve, while the stars stretched wide above them and the fire cracked softly in the hearth, Camden pulled Sienna close and whispered, "You still haven't told me the first moment you knew." She traced her fingers down his chest. "It was the night you brought Piper that giraffe drawing. I looked at it and realized I'd never been seen that clearly before." Camden leaned down, his voice a hush against her lips. "And I knew the moment you handed me that paper bag of returned tea." That was sarcasm. "No," he said, brushing her cheek. "That was your way of saying I'm ready to let someone in." They kissed, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that doesn't ask for anything but gives everything. Outside, snow began to fall, dusting the porch in silence. Inside, they held each other like home wasn't a place anymore, it was a person. And for the first time in her life, Sienna Stone didn't just feel like she'd built something worth keeping. She felt kept entirely, eternally, undeniably. And so did he.